I will move the House File 4293 to have it before us, and I'll move the DE2 amendment to have it before us. And with that, I'll have Mr. Gehring and Ms. Roberts do the walk through the bill, explain provisions. Mr. Gehring, are you going first?
Mr. Chair, I think Ms. Roberts will go first with the spreadsheet.
Ms. Roberts, if you want to go through the spreadsheet.
Mr. Chair, this is Helen Roberts from the House Fiscal Staff, and I'm sharing my screen. I just want to make sure that people can see it.
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. So for this presentation, I'm going to be walking through the spreadsheet, and I will only be going through the change items and only the columns that represent the DE2 amendment. We found that it's easier for members to see if we only show limited columns, but as always, I can provide additional information to members, such as the governor's recommendations or comparison to the base outside of this presentation. To begin with, I'm going to start with the first group of change items, which is for the legislature. On line 6, you can see there's a House operating adjustment of $1.2 million for fiscal year 23. On line 7, there is a $200,000 operating adjustment for the House Sergeant at Arms. On line 8, for the LCC, an operating adjustment of $869,000. This is for all of the LCC joint offices, including the legislative auditor, reviser, library, and all the various commissions. On line 9, $185,000 for a diversity and inclusion officer for the entire legislature. On line 10 of the spreadsheet, there is funding for translation services for the legislature. This is from House File 2545, Representative Lee's bill. And then on line 11, $30,000 increase for the Pension Commission actuarial services. On line 12, you'll see the funding for House File 4036, Representative Claiborne's bill for the Legislative Task Force on Aging. That's $138,000. And then finally, on line 13, for the reviser of statutes, $14 million in a one-time request for an information technology project to replace the bill drafting system. So the total, and I'm sorry, I realize that I'm showing the Excel view, which is probably not, let me see if I can at least get that page 1 off of there. The total for the legislature is $16.9 million. Moving on, for the Attorney General, there's an operating adjustment of $2.3 million. For the Secretary of State, there's 2 change items in the direct appropriations. The first is $210,000 for a Chief Information Officer. And then on line 27, $100,000 for civic engagement and youth outreach. In addition to these 2 appropriations, at the end of the appropriations article, you'll find the state match for the most recent round of federal election security funding, or the HABA funds, and that's $230,000. Moving down to the Campaign Finance Board, there's a one-time appropriation of $5,000 to cover the costs for the board for implementation of House File 3190. That's Representative Long's bill. Moving on to minute services on line 35, or on 36, there is funding for the state match for the federal cybersecurity grant program. On line 37, the enterprise cloud transformation, a total of $12.4 million in fiscal year 22-23. On line 38, under executive branch technology modernization, $10.2 million in the current biennium. On line 39, for accessibility assessment, $256,000. And then for the Children's Cabinet IT innovation, $750,000. And finally, the last change item for minute is the funding for advanced cybersecurity tools of $10.2 million. So the total general fund change for Minute would be $35.6 million. In addition, there's $150,000 from the Special Revenue Fund for supporting accessible technology in state government. And then finally, on line 44, you see the cybersecurity grant program. These are the federal dollars that would be matched by the state dollars above. Moving on to the Department of Administration on line 47, $250,000 for enterprise language access services. This is a transfer out of the general fund. $1.9 million for the Procurement Technical Assistance Center, known as PTAC, and also for a disparity study. On line 49, there's another general fund transfer of $630,000. This would be a transfer to the Fleet Fund. That's an internal service fund, and it's to address revenue loss in that fund. Next, on line 50, $301,000 for improving human resources and financial services. On line 51, there's $556,000 for the Office of Enterprise Translations. And then on line 52, $400,000 for improving grants administration oversight. On line 53, you'll see the Office of Collaboration and Dispute Resolution, $150,000. On line 54, $773,000 in one-time funding for the Ampers Community Radio Service. Below that, on line 55, $200,000 for the Minnesota Field Archaeology and Private Cemeteries Act update contained in this amendment. And then moving down, you'll see two additional appropriations related to COVID worker compensation costs. The first, there's $1 million in one-time funds for state agency workers' comp claims that were incurred prior to March 4th of 2021. And then beneath that on line 57, $2.5 million for COVID workers' compensation costs related to Chapter 32. You may remember that this was a bill that was passed, I believe, in the first or second week of this session. And finally, for under admin, there's $2 million for public television block grants. That's for House File 4248. That's Representative Carlson's bill. And so the total general fund change for admin is $10.7 million. Moving on to Minnesota Management and Budget. On line 65, there's $7.3 million to stabilize and sustain the state's ERP systems. Then underneath that, there's $1 million for cross-agency coordination related to the Children's Cabinet. On line 68, $300,000 for evaluating the impact of state investments. And then finally, under Minute, there is $93,000, or under MMB, excuse me, $93,000 for implementing the recommendations of the Task Force on Employees with Disabilities. This was House File 2017, Representative Ryer's bill. So the total for MMB is $8.7 million change in the general fund. For the Historical Society, there are three change items. The first is $500,000 for an operating adjustment. Second, one-time funding of $750,000 for operational support for the reopening of historic sites across the state. And then finally, $32,000 for the State Emblem Commission. This was House File 284, Representative Freiburg's bill. So a total change for the Historical Society of $1.3 million in fiscal year 23. Moving down for the Humanities Center, there is an operating adjustment of $22,000. That's on line 85. And then on line 89, for the Board of Accountancy, $120,000 for licensing and enforcement program support. And then the last two items under expenditures, for the Barbers Examiners Board, there's $17,000 in one-time costs These are related to the licensing modifications that were in House File 3986, Representative Nelson's bill. And then finally, for the Cosmetologist Examiners Board, $20,000 for implementation of the OLA recommendations. This was House File 4390, Representative Mason's bill. So moving down on line 118, you can see the total general fund change is $76.2 million, and then additional 400,000 from the special revenue fund. So the net expenditure change for all funds is $76.6 million. At the bottom of the spreadsheet, you'll see there's some really very small revenue changes related to some of the provisions in the bill, and those would total $3,000. And so the net general fund change, going down to the very last line of the spreadsheet, this is the net of both expenditures and revenue changes, is the 76.638. That's for all funds. For general fund, it's 76.238. And I know I went through that very fast, but if there are any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'll stop sharing my screen.
Representative Elkins, you got your hand up?
Yeah, just a real quick question. There is an appropriation somewhere here for the Office of Small Agencies to do a study, and I see it on all of the bill summaries, but I don't see where it's buried on Ms. Roberts' spreadsheet.
Ms. Roberts.
Mr. Chair and Representative Elkins, I believe that is, you're right, sort of buried in the spreadsheet on line 50 under improving human resources and financial services.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
With that, no more questions. Mr. Gehring.
Mr. Chair and committee members, Matt Gehring from the House Research Department. I'm going to share the screen here. And what I'll do is walk through the DE2 document. There, within the committee materials, there's a section by section summary, as well as this tracking kind of policy chart. That's the one that's shared on the screen here. I'm going to go through fairly quickly all the policy items just to highlight mostly where they come from and just give a general overview of what they are, starting with with Article 2, which starts on page 9 of the DE2 amendment. So section 1 of Article 2 on page 9 is the first section that comes from the LCC's technical administrative bill that the committee saw earlier. This is the section that allows the director of the LCC to enter contracts. Section 2 comes from House File 3087, which is the language that allows the Executive Council to accept other types of collateral for deposit with MMB. Section 3 is the first of 2 sections from Representative Richardson's bill that this one aligns the date of the current state observance of Juneteenth so that it falls on June 19th of each year. And then later on in this article is the actual designation of Juneteenth as an official state holiday. Sections 4 through 10 all come from Representative Bonner's House File 4568. This is the language, runs from pages 11 through 14 of the DE2. This is the language that authorizes the governor to use his Chapter 12 emergency powers to respond to cyber attacks and other threats against the state's IT systems. Moving ahead to page 15. Is section 11, which is part of the governor's supplemental policy request related to data practices and the process for appealing a decision about an individual's data classification. Section 12 also comes from that same bill, the governor's bill, related to the fees that are charged for requests for an advisory opinion on open meetings law issues. Sections 13 through 15, this is pages 17 and 18 of the DE2, come from the LCC bill. This is language that updates and makes current the statutes that govern the Legislative Salary Council. So some of the language there is now obsolete because the Salary Council has met for several cycles now and the dates can be removed. Sections 16 and 17 go together. This is also from the governor's supplemental policy bill. This is the language that changes the way that billing is made for statewide systems from the statewide systems account. The statewide systems are the payroll accounting systems, HR and procurement systems, and other information access systems. Next is a series of sections that come from the Department of Administration's bill. Sections 18 through 23 all have admin language in them. These are the sections that relate to the work of the State Designer Board and when the State Designer Selection Board is required to be used. Built in there is also the codification of the Office of Collaboration and Dispute Resolution. Sections 24 and 25 come from the governor's policy request. This is the establishment of the Office of Enterprise Translation within the Department of Administration. And there's both the creation of that office as well as the account established to fund those types of services within state government. Section 26 on page 24 of the DE2 authorizes agencies to retain a default percentage of appropriations for grants for administrative costs associated with administering the grants. Sections 27 and 28 also come from the Department of Administration's bill related to both the designer selection board process and then also the emergency acquisition of certain types of purchases. Section 29 is the language that allows Minute to make grants to local governments for cybersecurity risks and threats. And then there's a series of sections that starts on page 27 of the DE2, running all the way through page 44. Sections 30 through 54 all come from Representative Ryer's House File 2017. This is the language that came out of the task force on state employees with disabilities. So there's a whole series of sections related to that work here. Within those sections, I just want to highlight two sections, 44 and 45 on page 34 of the DE2 are not related to the state employees with disabilities. Those are the military differential pay sections that the committee heard about last week. And then, Mr. Chair, moving ahead to page 45 of the DE2, you'll see section 55. This is the first of a few sections that relate to the deposit of certain funds into trust accounts that go to the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. And then, let's see, I lost my place here. Section 56, also on page 45, is the language that comes from Representative Albright's bill. There's also language in there from Representative Freiburg that expands the ability of local governments to choose investments for their funds. That's sections 56, 57, and 58. On section 59 on page 47 of the DE2 is language that expands the qualification criteria that the governor must consider when making appointments to the Minnesota State Board of Trustees. The Trustee Candidate Advisory Council is being repealed as part of the LCC's administrative bill. That repealer comes a little bit later in this article. Sections 60 and 61, also on page 47, come from the Department of Administration's bill. And there's actually we sort of bounce back and forth through a series of sections that go back and forth between the Department of Administration's bill and the LCC's administrative bill. Section 62 comes from the LCC's bill. It clarifies the appointment terms and process for citizen members of the Mississippi River Parkway Commission. Section 63 is a fairly long section that makes some updates to the laws that govern the treatment of human burial sites in cemeteries around the state. Then section 64, 65, and 66 go back to the housing policy I mentioned earlier about the way that certain funds are deposited with the state and the designation of those funds to the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. On page 60, section 67 comes from Representative Hanson's bill. This is the language that relates to the local government's permission for creation of the use of native landscapes on properties within local governments. Section 68 is the section I mentioned earlier that designates Juneteenth, June 19th of each year as an official state holiday rather than just the existing state observance. That comes from Representative Richardson's bill. Section 69 relates back to the military salary differential issue that the committee heard about last week. Section 70 is the IRRB separation retention incentive program. That's Representative Eklund's bill that the committee heard last week. Section 71 is the policy section that goes along with Representative Elkins's question about the funding for the small agency study. This is the actual direction in Section 71 of Article 2 to conduct that study and the details for what will be studied. On page 63 of the DE2, Section 72 is the first section that relates to Representative Freiburg's State Emblems Redesign Commission. This is the language that would establish a commission to review both the state seal and the official state flag and recommend new designs for both that would be effective if the legislature adopts them May 11th of 2023. Section 74 on page 64 of the DE2 is Representative Cleaborn's Legislative Task Force on Aging. This is the task force that would study the possibility of creating a new state department on aging. Section 75 relates back to Representative Ryer's House File 2017. This is the recommendations of the task force on state employees with disabilities. Section 76 is a revisor instruction directing the revisor of statutes supported by House Research and Senate Council to review statutes for compliance with the Equal Rights Amendment. And Section 77, the last section of this article, contains a number of repealers that sort of go along with other policy items that are I previously talked about in the bill. And Mr. Chair, that's the end of Article 2. That's the general state government policy article. And then next, I'm going to move to Article 3. Article 3 starts on page 69 of the DE2, if you're following along. A whole bunch of sections in this article come from the Secretary of State's Elections Administrative Technical Bill. This committee has seen those sections in a variety of forms and places over the last several years. I'm not going to talk through those. I'm just going to highlight the sort of things that are new to the committee this year or maybe different. So the first section I'm going to highlight in Article 3 is Section 2. This is Representative Long's bill that establishes the definition of expressly advocating in the campaign finance law. And as a reminder, this term is used to determine whether a campaign expenditure has to be reported to the Campaign Finance Board. Or I should say whether an expenditure is a campaign expenditure that has to be reported to the board. On page 70, Section 3 of Article 3 is Representative Cleaborn's bill that relates to special access for lobbyists to certain facilities and events that are hosted by candidates for office. And then I'm going to move ahead to page 82 of Article 3. Again, everything in between there is the Secretary of State's Elections Administrative Bill. Section 21 on page 82 is the first of a series of sections from Representative Cleaborn's bill that extends the period of time during which absentee ballots can be opened and counted, as well as the ability for individuals to vote using a live ballot machine from 7 days prior to an election to 14 days. So there's a number of sections that will come that conform to that new standard of a 14-day period rather than a 7-day period for that work to happen. On page 83, Section 22 is Representative Greenman's language that the committee heard last week related to the use of absentee ballot boxes. So there's new standards for placement of those ballot boxes and how they're distributed around the state or around the jurisdiction, among other things. That's Section 22. Section 23 goes along with that bill. That requires some documentation of who is accessing the ballot boxes, how many ballots are collected, and the like. Section 25 of Article 3 goes back to Representative Cleaborn's bill about the timing of the counting of absentee ballots. Section 26 is the same, as well as Section 27, all relate to Representative Cleaborn's bill. Moving ahead to Section 33 of Article 3, that's another piece of Representative Greenman's bill requiring certain statistics about absentee ballots to be reported to the Secretary of State, who then reports them to the legislature about the method of voting, whether it's the use of the drop box, mail, in person, or direct balloting. Section 36, this is on page 93 of the DE2, is I think the last one, no, maybe not. It's one of Representative Cleavorn's sections. Again, that goes to the timing of the absentee balloting process and the extension of the period from 7 days to 14 days during which ballots may be open and counted. This is a conforming change to go along with those sections. On page 96, sections 42 and 43 also relate to Representative Cleavorn's bill. And then I'm going to move ahead to page 103. Sections 55, 56, and 57 are all from Representative Long's bill. This is the section that has that relates to the appropriation of the Campaign Finance Board that Ms. Roberts talked about. This is requiring additional disclosure of donors on independent expenditures. The top 3 donors would need to be identified on independent expenditures. And then there's also the requirement that the Campaign Finance Board establish standards for how a disclaimer will be printed on items where it's small items where it's difficult to actually print a full disclaimer. On page 104 of the DE2, section 58 is Representative Nash's bill. This is the language that requires certain notices on mailings that are sent by private organizations that include an absentee ballot application or a sample ballot. And then section 59 and page 105 is Representative Greenman's bill that relates to intimidation or interference with the duties of an election official. This is the bill that the committee heard several weeks ago that includes both criminal and civil enforcement remedies and a number of activities that are prohibited that relate to interference and intimidation of election officials. Section 61 goes along with that. That makes clear that the administrative process does not apply to the remedies that are established for that intimidation and interference work. It's instead both a civil and criminal penalty process, which would go through the traditional court system. And Mr. Chair, that's the end of Article 3. Again, the sections I didn't highlight in that walkthrough all relate back to the Secretary of State's administrative bill that the committee has heard before. And then lastly, Article 4 is the last article of the DE2. This is the barbering and cosmetology article. Sections 1 through 16 of that article, which runs from page 109 to page 120, are all the technical and administrative updates of the Board of Barber Examiners. The focus, there's a variety of sort of miscellaneous changes there. The focus is primarily on the barber examination process, as well as requirements that relate to mobile barber shops. And then starting with section 17 on page 121 through the end of the article is the sections that relate to the practice of cosmetology. There's, again, a variety of sections there. There's a focus on establishing a 3-year license for hair technicians and other implementation of the recommendations of the Office of the Legislative Auditor. And then the last section in that article is a repealer that relates back to the Board of Barber Examiners. And Mr. Chair, that is the entirety of the DE2 and the policy contained in Articles 2 through 4.
Thank you, Mr. Gehring.